Will Wootton. Welcome to Butser Ancient Farm. You're here to help us with the new mosaic that we're going to do in the villa. And I want to talk about that, but before I do, I wonder if you'd like to tell us about yourself.
I'm a lecturer, senior lecturer in Roman art at King's College London, and my main interests are in craftsmanship in the ancient world. I've worked a lot on mosaics, I've made mosaics myself, and I came in really through that sort of background of making things, and really my career has focused on looking at how craftsmen work, the sort of techniques, processes, tools that they used, the materials of course, and then also some of those social aspects, how they organised themselves, who they were, men, women, children, how they fitted into patterns of labour when it came to making things. So, I'm really interested broadly in the ancient world, but how craftsmanship really operated, and that's why I'm so fascinated also by the work that you do here at Butser.
Can you tell us a bit about what we're doing, what the pattern is and what the technique is?
The hypocaust room here at the end of the villa behind us had at Sparsholt, where the original villa was excavated, had a partially preserved mosaic, and so what we've done is use that as a basis to then create a reconstruction, but because we've only got it partially, we're being a little bit creative. We're using the archaeological evidence that we have for other villas in the area. It's got very nice swastika meanders, got some gouache pattern, these two strands braided patterns, a sort of rougher exterior, the interior being a square with these geometric patterns in. But also because this room may have been quite important, quite a high status room, we're going to put a figurative design in the centre, and that's what Gary Drossel is designing. There's some very nice local mosaics that have seasons, figures representing particular moments in the year. And so what he's doing is thinking about a design that will both, pick up on the sorts of designs which were in vogue in the Roman world in Britain, but also updating it slightly for the contemporary and also for Butser itself. I think, we're using authentic ancient techniques. We're going to lay it directly, and we're going to be absolutely trying to understand whether the sorts of methods that we're using were possible in antiquity, were valid, or even good ways to make a mosaic floor. But we're also conscious that we're not just making a sort of replica. We want to make something that can live here at Butser, that people coming to see it can enjoy, and so it may have a little sort of modern, contemporary flavour to it.
It's interesting what you say there about sort of an authentic, if updated, design, because I think certainly for me, and I think probably for a lot of people, you think, well, a mosaic is just a thing made of these little tiles. But when you look at them, they're vastly different across the Roman world and across antiquity. They're vastly different from place to place and from time to time. So I think Gary's doing, even though we don't know the full details, he's doing something in early to mid 4th century style, which is when our villa sort of reached its peak. So that's interesting in itself. But the other thing is that, again, I assumed, and I think a lot of people assume, that we know everything about how mosaics are made. They're easy, but most modern mosaics are made with glue. And we're making it with a fairly crude form of cement. And that's why, as you said, that's direct laying, so wet cement on the floor, sticking these little tesserae into it. And it's an unknown, because glue, we know the properties of. It's liquid and it sets hard. This cement is a little less, it's not a modern material, and it's a little bit hit and miss. So anything might happen, which gives it a little bit of danger, a little bit of chance to it, which is exciting but worrying, I guess, from your perspective.
I think, one tries to reduce chance and danger as much as possible. But I agree. We're using materials that are rarely used nowadays. In Italy, a lime mortar is still used in particular situations. It gives us a bit more flexibility, in fact. It doesn't set too quickly. and it remains flexible, so it's workable. But what we're using is a method where the bed in which we're setting the pieces is very thin. So we're relying on regular cutting, but also a hard subfloor that between which we can compact and create a nice flat surface. What for me is so wonderful about mosaics, and why I think you do get that huge variation across the Roman world, is mosaic, in antiquity at least, is an art of installation. So it has to respond to the place in which it goes. It's not made in a shop elsewhere and bought off the shelf and then taken and put in. So there's always that dialogue between the client, the patron, and the makers, and that's what results then in the mosaic. And that's also why I'm interested with Gary's design in doing something that also responds to Butser, because that seems to me true to the nature of the project. We're going to install it here, we're going to install it at a particular moment in time, and I think it needs that little bit to be a real thing. It needs to respond a little bit to that context.
I think that's a great opportunity that we have with that particular room, because we know it had a mosaic in it, in the original villa, but only a fragment. So it's the clue. It had a mosaic, but then everything else is open to interpretation, which gives a lot of flexibility, doesn't it? And the other thing is, I know that there are more than 1,000 mosaics and partial mosaics discovered in Britain, aren't there? But as far as I know, no two are exactly alike. They weren't just sort of popped out. Here's our mosaic model, we'll just keep doing this floor everywhere. So they all, as you say, they sort of all respond to their environment. They respond probably to the wants of the people who commission them, maybe the villa owner or whoever.
Yeah, I mean, they're not identical, but we get lots of variation on themes, both in terms of the figurative designs. There are particular designs that were very fashionable in certain areas of the country, and then we do get very sort of similar formats, so the layout, whether with lozenges or squares, roundels, that sort of thing, and then the geometric patterns themselves. But there's lots of variation, and that's exactly right. They are variations, and they are designed for the location. So they do need to be adapted and updated, even if they're using perhaps similar models, ideas, or fashions. People wanting to have something that responds to what someone down the road has got, someone in Rome or on the continent, and that's clearly important. These mosaics were a way of investment. They presumably were costly, not if only in time and materials, and so they wanted to get money back on that investment. They weren't putting it in a bank, they were putting it in their property. And what that property was meant to do was to speak to who they were, to their own aspirations, but also to their status. So these mosaics gave that relationship back to the continental world, talked about their knowledge, their education through the myths and legends sometimes depicted on them, or simply their status and money through the complex geometric patterns that they were able to get someone else to make for them.
Yes, I mean, if they were easy and cheap, they'd be everywhere, but you tend to only find them, I suppose you would say, in the showiest of rooms. Although they're not only for the billionaires, but they're in the sort of top 4% of the population in earnings, I would have imagined. One of the sort of incidental experimental outcomes here was that we found the mosaic floor is much easier to keep clean than any of the other floors in this place, which they have a sort of fairly traditional lime mortar floor elsewhere, and the penny drop. That's actually a practical application from why you might have a mosaic floor, or sometimes they're just a very simple tessellated floor, but they're much easier to clean than the rest of the villa. One of my favourite stories from Roman Britain about mosaics is from Dorchester, and I was reading about a nice mosaic floor that was excavated there, and they had damage in one edge of the mosaic, which they interpreted as furniture being dragged across the floor. And I just love that, because it really put the humanity back into it. You can almost imagine some poor slave trying to put a mat over it to hide the damage. So building it the way that we're going to build it there is that level of jeopardy, because it can be quite fragile. But the irony to that is, I think that's the fragility is its strength, because the other thing is a modern concrete floor is not going to last 2,000 years. But because mosaics are quite lightly built with this light but flexible material, lime, they can slump, they can move.
Yeah, well, they do have incredible flexibility. I mean, I think Fishbourne's a very nice example, if you've been to see the villa there, about how, with natural ground movement, the mosaic itself can flex around that movement, and that's what happened at Fishbourne. And you get these very sort of interesting sort of topographical style mosaics only through the years of their burial. So lime does work really well like that. And I think, coming back to sort of thinking about utility, these floors were sort of often could be multifunctional spaces, so furniture could be moved in and out of them. Mosaic holds together incredibly well as long as it remains entire, as long as it's not damaged in any way. And actually, once you start losing a tessera here and there, you then can get loss very, very quickly. So from a sort of conservation and preservation point of view, you want to maintain the integrity of the floor. So you can imagine, dragging furniture across it is not a great idea, because it's great with loads coming down, but not brilliant if you try to pick the pieces out. And then once you start losing one or two, quite a few can begin to go.
Yep.
So, it's a nice sort of metaphor for the importance of the whole, and that, if the whole can remain integral, then it's actually can last for decades, hundreds or thousands of years. But as soon as you start to have deterioration and loss, then actually it can fall apart very fast.
Yeah. There's really not much that we do know about the people who made them, is there?
I think that's true, and I think traditionally scholarship has been very interested in the sort of decorative aspects, understanding form and pattern, in particular the figurative mosaics. People have loved the pictures and been really interested in interpreting those and interpreting what they mean or what they meant, let's say, for the original patrons and clients. There's been less work done on the craftspeople, who they were, and also on the actual production processes. The issue really within academia is often us academics are not particularly practical, so those sorts of questions may not arise. But I think more recently, over the last couple of decades, as experimental archaeology has become much more sort of conceived as a valid discipline within the sort of overall arching academic environment, I think there are many more people now who are really fascinated in the processes of making, but then from sort of trying to understand those, then get into thinking, well, how did those processes work in practice? How did they hold tools? How did they get their material? What did they feel like when they were working? And once you get to that, then you're sort of right into who was doing it. Was it just men who are usually sort of cited in the scholarship? And of course it wasn't. We've got good evidence, amazing evidence like footprints in the mortar to show that actually we've got a range of different sized people, different people with different weights, which suggests that we may well have men, women, children all working together on site making things like mosaics.
You can break up a mosaic and see the basics of how it was made, and also Vitruvius wrote really well on a great way to actually kind of make the floor. But beyond that, it's the area that you're dealing with, which is the people, the sort of human process in production that we don't know anything about. No one seems to have bothered to write anything about these, what I think are incredibly skilled craftspeople.
You're very right, Trevor, in terms of the sorts of evidence that we have. We've got literary sources like Vitruvius, again copied a bit by Pliny, that gives us one view. Vitruvius was an architect, so he gives us that architect's view rather than the sort
best
of
possible case.
Builder, labourer, and people talk about this as being him giving us the sort of Rolls-Royce pavement. But when you look at the archaeology, there's a lot of variation. Some people, do make pavements that look like what Vitruvius described. others, built them on sand and, used sort of slightly, let's say, less rigorous methods than Vitruvius. And I think, we have that sort of elite voices. We have some images, very rare, but there's a few images of craftsmen at work, mosaicists as well as others. And then we just have the archaeological evidence itself. And so from my point of view, I think in doing this, there's sort of the practice of it, because the archaeology is clearly a sort of static piece of evidence. And I think once you get into making things, you realize that what's really interesting are things like sequence, the order in which you do things, and the impact that order can have on the outcome.
We learned quite a few things actually in the mosaic that we did 2 years ago now, and most of them were unexpected, but one of them was about how physically demanding it was to do it. And I used to joke that if I could get our volunteer mosaicists to sit there for several years doing that, I could go into their, I could do radiographs of them and look at the osteology of ancient Rome and determine who was a mosaicist, because you get these repetitive pains that occur from laying mosaics, because you're stuck in a position. The light levels can be terrible to work with. I think that kind of experiential part of it as well, it puts you in touch with people in the past. It actually puts you in touch with the economics of the Roman world to a certain extent, given that mosaicists don't seem to be really well paid. So I think the aches and pains are instructive in their own right.
I think you're right, and I think even just working with hammers and hardies, you begin to see that you can't just sit down and work with them for a whole day. That you really have to work into it quite slowly. That it's quite difficult to begin with. That idea that the craft shapes the human body is a really interesting one. As a tool person, I tend to have quite a sort of hunched back, which is quite painful to sort of see. And because of my work, I sit at a desk with my laptop, all curved over. But the images of the very few number of images that we have of mosaic makers is with this sort of curved hunch as they hunch over and cut. And so, there is exactly that sort of recognizable body image that then is the sort of archetype of the stone cutter. So it sort of works side by side.
There are images of making tesserae in antiquity, aren't there? So we actually know the tools.
Yeah.
I mean, we find the tools in archaeology as well. So we can be quite confident that we're doing something authentically. I came to do the original mosaic really in an upside down way, because I'd laid some concrete floors before, so I was seen as the ideal person. But that actually brought me, I'll say, to scholarship, in the sense that I became fascinated by mosaics, by, I suppose you'd say, the interpretation, what does the pattern might mean, but more particularly in how you set them out, and how in antiquity you create patterns that appear seamless. They don't appear to start anywhere, they don't appear to finish anywhere, and it seems a lot less straightforward than initially it looks. So I can imagine a lot of students, as a lot of volunteers we found, that'll enhance their academic interest in these things as well. I think, to be honest, I think that's one of the most important areas of experimental archaeology. It's not just about we have a problem and we find a solution, or we test a theory. I think it's also the experience that can really hone, anyone who practices it can really hone your interest and your vision into the process that you're doing, and just pique your interest. So all of those things are important.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice point. And I with the mosaic that you made, you had to make a guilloche, one of these braid patterns. And I think the guilloche is a really interesting example of sort of that problem in action. We also had the students making a guilloche. So they learned to cut, and then they just started the process of making this braided pattern, 2 strands essentially sort of interleaved into a braid. But what we needed them to do was to move from essentially looking at this pattern and copying it to understanding it. And you can very much see that the craftsmen in antiquity understood the pattern, and they had various systems for replicating it. And that meant that they could expand or contract it, they could double it up. Gave them enormous flexibility to do what seemed to be a very complex bit of geometry, but actually quite simply. If you try to copy the pattern now, you get yourselves in all sorts of trouble. But in the ancient world, they literally could run these lengths of pattern out. So there's a really nice sort of symbolic thing here, which is about moving from looking and trying to copy something to trying to understand it. And I think that's what experimental archaeology sort of does. And copying means that you don't really understand quite what you're doing and why you're doing it. It can lead to answers and dead ends, but also, you know, solutions. But I think when you suddenly understand it, that's when, you know, you've got to a really good level.
I can't wait to get started. I know we've made a little, dipped our toes in the water today, but we'll get cracking big time shortly.
Absolutely. No, I'm super excited. It's great to see the students down here. Great to see you all. Thanks for your support, and I can't wait for next year and actually getting the project done.
Brilliant. I'm going to go and get my trowel now.